Something shifts in a man after extended solitude. The desperation that once clouded his vision burns away in the silence. The compromises he used to make without thinking suddenly appear absurd when examined through eyes unconditioned by constant need. What emerges isn't bitterness or withdrawal. It's clarity so sharp that returning to old patterns becomes impossible. The man who's lived with himself long enough stops seeing women through the distorted lens of deficiency and begins perceiving them with a precision that changes everything about how he engages. Most men never reach this point because they fear the solitude required to get there. They chase connection to connection, never allowing the space necessary for transformation. But the man who endures discovers something revolutionary. Solitude dissolves the illusion of necessity. Living alone strips away the comfortable lie that a man needs female presence to be complete. In the beginning, the absence screams. The empty space where someone else's energy used to be feels like amputation. He reaches for his phone compulsively, checks for messages that don't come, fills the silence with distractions that only amplify the void. But if he doesn't run, if he sits with the discomfort instead of immediately seeking to fill it, something extraordinary happens. The panic subsides. The desperation loosens its grip. He discovers that the thing he thought would destroy him, being truly alone with himself, doesn't destroy him at all. The mornings still come, the days still pass, life continues, and gradually he realizes it continues quite well. This realization fundamentally alters his relationship with women. When a man no longer needs female validation to feel whole, he stops approaching women as solutions to internal problems. The desperate energy that used to emanate from him, the subtle but palpable need that women could sense and instinctively recoiled from, simply disappears. He's no longer auditioning for acceptance or performing for approval. He's complete on his own terms, and any woman who enters his life does so as an addition rather than a remedy. This shift is invisible to him at first, but immediately apparent to women. They sense the difference between a man who wants them and a man who needs them. One feels like freedom. The other feels like burden. The man who's lived alone long enough radiates the former because he's proven to himself, in the crucible of solitude, that he doesn't require external validation to maintain internal stability. The dissolution of necessity also brings brutal honesty about what he actually wants versus what he thought he was supposed to want. Without the constant noise of companionship, without the need to compromise or accommodate, a man's authentic preferences emerge with startling clarity. He discovers that many of the qualities he claimed to value were simply what he thought would make him acceptable or what culture told him to prioritize. In solitude, pretense becomes exhausting. He can't sustain the performance when there's no audience. What remains is raw truth about his desires, his boundaries, his non-negotiables. This self-knowledge makes him unmovable in ways that frustrate women accustomed to shaping men through subtle manipulation or emotional pressure. He knows what he wants because he's spent time alone figuring it out, and that certainty cannot be easily swayed. Distance creates immunity to emotional manipulation. Extended solitude teaches a man to regulate his own emotional state without relying on external soothing. When distress arises, he can't immediately seek comfort from a partner. When anxiety spikes, he can't deflect it through connection. He's forced to develop the capacity to return himself to equilibrium without help. This repeated practice builds psychological muscle that makes him nearly immune to common forms of emotional manipulation. The tactics that work on men desperate for approval, withdrawal of affection, manufactured jealousy, threatened departure, emotional volatility designed to keep him off balance, lose their power over someone who's learned to maintain his center regardless of external turbulence. Women sense this immediately, and it disorients those accustomed to controlling men through emotional leverage. The man who's lived alone doesn't panic when she goes quiet. He doesn't spiral when she creates distance. He doesn't scramble to fix every fluctuation in her mood. This isn't because he doesn't care. It's because he's developed the capacity to distinguish between her temporary emotional state and actual relationship catastrophe. He can hold space for her feelings without being consumed by them, can remain grounded when she's destabilized, can maintain his own emotional reality while acknowledging hers. This quality, the ability to be unmoved by emotional storms, is both deeply attractive and deeply threatening. Attractive because it provides the masculine stability that feminine energy craves. Threatening because it removes the primary tool many women use to maintain control in relationships. The immunity extends beyond reactive manipulation to proactive testing. Women test men constantly, often unconsciously, to determine the strength of their frame and the authenticity of their groundedness. These tests come as irrational demands, manufactured drama, sudden shifts in behavior designed to see if the man will hold his center or scramble to accommodate. The man softened by constant companionship often fails these tests spectacularly, bending himself into pretzels to keep peace, revealing his weakness through his desperation to maintain harmony. The man hardened by solitude responds differently. He doesn't react with anger or punishment. He simply remains himself, unmoved by the test, responding to the content rather than the subtext. This response is the only thing that actually satisfies the test. Women aren't consciously hoping men will fail. They're hoping men will prove strong enough to remain solid when pushed. The solitary man passes by default because he's already proven to himself that he can stand alone. Clarity exposes incompatibility early. Living alone sharpens a man's ability to detect misalignment before emotional investment clouds judgment. When he's accustomed to his own rhythms, his own standards, his own way of being, deviations become immediately apparent. He notices when someone's energy feels chaotic rather than calm. He recognizes when values don't align. He catches early warning signs that used to be obscured by infatuation or the rush of new connection. This isn't paranoia or excessive scrutiny. It's simply accurate perception, unfiltered by need. The man who fears being alone overlooks incompatibility because acknowledging it means returning to a state he's trying desperately to avoid. The man comfortable in solitude has no such motivation to ignore reality. This clarity manifests as a kind of ruthless efficiency in filtering potential partners. He doesn't waste months or years in situations that are obviously wrong because he's no longer motivated by the sunk cost fallacy or the fear of being alone again. If something doesn't fit, he walks away with minimal drama and zero resentment. This behavior confuses women accustomed to men who cling, who try harder when things get difficult, who exhaust themselves attempting to force incompatible situations to work. His willingness to walk away isn't coldness or inability to commit. It's the wisdom that comes from knowing himself well enough to recognize when someone isn't suited to him and respecting both parties enough to acknowledge that truth rather than forcing a connection that requires one or both people to betray themselves. The clarity also prevents the common trap of settling. Many men accept relationships that are merely adequate because they fear nothing better will come along, or because the pain of continuing to search seems worse than the pain of accepting something mediocre. The man who's lived alone knows that adequate isn't worth the cost. He's experienced the peace of solitude, the freedom of not compromising, the satisfaction of living according to his own terms. Any relationship that asks him to sacrifice that peace had better offer something genuinely extraordinary in return. This standard eliminates most options immediately, and he's perfectly fine with that. He'd rather be alone than accept something that diminishes him. This preference isn't arrogance. It's the result of direct comparison between the quality of his solitary life and the quality of relationships that require him to become less than he is. Self-sufficiency transforms the value equation. A man who's mastered living alone brings nothing to a relationship that he needs from it. He's learned to cook, clean, manage his space, handle his finances, regulate his emotions, entertain himself, and create meaning in his life without assistance. This self-sufficiency fundamentally changes what he's looking for in a partner. He's not seeking a mother, a therapist, a maid, or a validation machine. He doesn't need someone to manage his life or make him feel adequate. The traditional exchange, his resources for her domestic labor and emotional support, holds no appeal because he's already providing those things for himself. What he's looking for is much more specific and much harder to find. Genuine compatibility, authentic attraction, complementary energy, shared values, and the kind of partnership that enhances rather than completes. This shift terrifies women who've built their relationship strategy around being needed. The dynamic where a man depends on her for basic life management gives her leverage and security. If he needs her to function, he's less likely to leave, more likely to tolerate poor behavior, more motivated to keep her happy. But the self-sufficient man doesn't need any of that. He'll appreciate effort and reciprocity, but he won't tolerate manipulation or poor treatment just because she does his laundry or cooks his meals. He can do those things himself, and he'd rather do them alone than accept them as payment for enduring disrespect. This removes the traditional framework many women use to evaluate their worth in relationships and forces a more honest reckoning with what they're actually bringing beyond utility. The self-sufficient man also becomes acutely aware of imbalance. When he's doing everything for himself, it's obvious when a woman enters his life and immediately begins extracting value without adding any. He notices when her presence creates more work, more drama, more complication, without corresponding benefit. He's no longer blinded by the novelty of having someone around because he knows exactly what his life looks like without her. If she makes it worse rather than better, if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, he has no emotional attachment to pretending otherwise. This pragmatic assessment feels cold to women who believe love should mean tolerating anything. But it's simply the result of having a clear baseline for comparison. He knows what peace feels like. He knows what freedom feels like. Any relationship that costs him those things without offering something genuinely valuable in return is a bad deal, and he's no longer in the market for bad deals. Detachment enables genuine appreciation. The paradox of extended solitude is that it allows a man to appreciate women more authentically because he's no longer viewing them through the filter of need. When he needed female validation, every interaction carried desperate subtext. He was performing, calculating, trying to secure the outcome he required. This made genuine appreciation impossible because he was too busy managing his own anxiety to actually see who was in front of him. After living alone long enough to dissolve that need, he can engage with women from a place of curiosity rather than agenda. He can notice and appreciate their qualities without immediately trying to extract something from them. He can enjoy their company without needing it to lead somewhere. This relaxed engagement is magnetic because it's so rare. Most men are always trying to get somewhere, always strategizing, always performing. The detached man is simply present. This detachment also prevents the idealization that leads to inevitable disappointment. When a man needs a woman to be perfect, he projects perfection onto her and then suffers when reality intrudes. The solitary man has no such investment in fantasy. He sees women clearly, with all their contradictions, flaws, and complexity, and finds that reality more interesting than any idealized version could be. He's not shocked when she has bad days, makes mistakes, or reveals qualities that contradict the image he initially formed. He expected humanity because he spent enough time alone to know that everyone, including himself, is messy and complicated. This acceptance creates space for authentic connection rather than the performance-based dynamic where both people are trying to maintain an impossible standard. The genuine appreciation that emerges from detachment also makes him better at recognizing and valuing what's actually valuable. When he's not desperate, he can distinguish between surface attraction and deeper compatibility. He can appreciate beauty without being controlled by it. He can recognize character, integrity, intelligence, humor, kindness, qualities that matter in sustained partnership, but get overlooked when a man is operating from scarcity. The solitary man operates from abundance not because he has endless options, but because he's abundant within himself. He doesn't need to secure anything from anyone, so he's free to appreciate what's actually there rather than what he desperately needs to be there. This shift in perception allows him to make better choices and to value women who deserve to be valued while remaining unmoved by those who offer nothing beyond surface appeal. Stoic acceptance replaces reactive pursuit. The man who's lived alone long enough stops chasing. Not because he's given up on connection, but because he's realized that pursuit from a place of deficiency never yields what he actually wants. The Stoic understanding that we control our actions but not outcomes becomes visceral truth rather than abstract philosophy. He can express interest, make himself available, demonstrate value, but he cannot control whether someone chooses him. And more importantly, he no longer needs them to choose him for his well-being to remain intact. This acceptance transforms his entire approach to women. He's no longer trying to convince, persuade, or win anyone over. He shows up as himself, clearly communicates his interest if it exists, and then allows the other person complete freedom to respond however they will. This Stoic frame is deeply attractive because it conveys unshakable self-respect. When a man is willing to walk away from anyone who doesn't enthusiastically want him, he signals that he values himself too much to beg for scraps of affection. Women sense this, and it triggers something primal. They recognize that this man won't tolerate being treated as an option, won't accept lukewarm interest, won't stick around trying to change someone's mind. This scarcity of tolerance, his complete unwillingness to accept anything less than genuine desire, makes his attention valuable. Women who are accustomed to men pursuing them regardless of their level of interest suddenly find themselves needing to demonstrate their own value to a man who doesn't need them to. The Stoic acceptance also eliminates the suffering that comes from attachment to specific outcomes. The solitary man can desire connection without requiring it, can prefer partnership without depending on it, can hope for reciprocation without being destroyed by its absence. This emotional flexibility comes from direct experience with the truth that happiness doesn't depend on external circumstances. He's been alone and discovered it's survivable, even enjoyable. He's lived without female validation and found his worth intact. These experiences create unshakable inner stability that no relationship can provide and no rejection can destroy. He approaches women from this foundation of self-sufficiency, offering partnership between equals rather than seeking rescue from incompleteness. The man who's lived alone long enough understands that women cannot complete him because he's already complete, and this understanding transforms everything about how he sees them, relates to them, and ultimately, how they respond to him.